Emily Davis stood at the edge of the school courtyard, clutching her backpack straps tightly. The wind rustled through the leaves of the ancient oak trees that surrounded the school grounds, carrying with it an eerie sense of history. She gazed up at the high school's looming facade, an old Gothic structure with ivy creeping up its weathered stone walls and arching windows that seemed to peer back at her like watchful eyes. The building had stood for over a century, casting its shadow over the small town, and the locals spoke of it with an odd mixture of reverence and fear. Emily had only been at this school for a few weeks since her family moved from the city, and already she felt the weight of its secrets. The other students avoided the basement, treating it like a forbidden place. They swapped stories in hushed tones about the sealed-off basement door, a massive iron slab, rusted and imposing, with faded warning signs plastered across it. "Do not enter." Emily had initially dismissed these tales as typical high school folklore, just another way to pass the time in this quiet, sleepy town. But the unease that settled in the pit of her stomach every time she passed that door told her otherwise. Her first encounter with the basement's dark presence happened on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. She had stayed late for detention, a minor infraction involving a cell phone in class. The school hallways were eerily quiet as she walked toward the front entrance, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The basement door was just ahead, tucked away in a dimly lit corner. She tried not to look at it, tried to ignore the chill that crept up her spine whenever she got too close. But as she hurried past, something caught her eye. A shadow moved across the door, a fleeting, shifting darkness that made her heart skip a beat. She froze, staring at the door, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow seemed to have substance, shape that twisted and writhed against the worn metal. For a moment she thought she heard her name, softly, almost like a sigh carried by the wind. "Emily!" She stumbled back, eyes wide, her mind racing to rationalize what she had just seen. "It's just my imagination," she muttered to herself. "Just the lighting." But even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. The shadow had moved with purpose, with intent. It was as if something behind that door was aware of her presence, something that wanted her to notice it. For the next few days, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She started having nightmares, vivid, twisted dreams of wandering the school's dark hallways alone, always being drawn toward the basement. In these dreams, the school was not just a building, it was a living entity, its walls pulsing like the insides of a monstrous heart. The basement door would loom before her, and behind it, she could hear whispers, faint, disembodied voices calling out to her, begging for release. But every time she reached for the door, she would wake up, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. During the day, the shadows followed her. She would catch glimpses of them out of the corner of her eye, flitting across the classroom floor, sliding along the walls of the hallway. They would vanish the moment she turned her head, leaving her to question her sanity. Were they figments of her imagination, a manifestation of the anxiety that had gripped her since her move? Or was there something more sinister at play? She confided in one of her classmates, Lucy, a quiet girl who seemed to know more about the school's history than she let on. Lucy's expression turned grave when Emily mentioned the basement. "You're not the first to see them," she said quietly. "The shadows. They've been here for as long as the school itself. They say the basement is cursed, that something happened down there a long time ago, something that left a mark." Emily pressed for more, but Lucy just shook her head. "It's better if you don't dig too deep," she warned. "Some doors are meant to stay closed." But the warning only fueled Emily's curiosity. She couldn't ignore the feeling that the shadows were trying to communicate with her, that they needed her for something. Each time they appeared, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Help us. Find us." The breaking point came one late afternoon when she stayed after school to make up for a missed assignment. The hallways were deserted, the sky outside darkening with the approach of a storm. As she gathered her things to leave, she heard it again, a faint whisper drifting through the empty corridor. "Emily." This time it was not her name alone. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping and urgent. She turned toward the basement door. The shadows were there, swirling around the edges, spilling out like ink, seeping through cracks in the stone. They pulsed and shifted, taking on vague human forms, faces distorted with anguish, hands reaching out, pressing against an invisible barrier. Emily's breath quickened. She felt an almost magnetic pull toward the door. Her body moved on its own, her feet carrying her forward as if in a trance. The shadows parted slightly, making way for her as she approached. She reached out, her hand trembling, to touch the cold iron surface. For a moment, the shadows seemed to draw back, their whispers silencing, as if holding their breath in anticipation. The instant her fingers brushed the door, a jolt of icy cold shot through her arm, and the voices erupted into a cacophony of screams. Emily yanked her hand back, stumbling away, her mind reeling. The shadows surged forward, and for the briefest moment she saw them, children, their faces contorted in fear and despair, mouths open in silent screams. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they dissolved into the darkness, leaving her alone in the hallway, gasping for air. She backed away, her eyes locked on the door, heart hammering in her chest. The basement was not just a dark, creepy part of the school. It was a prison, and the shadows were its captives. They were calling to her, drawing her into their nightmare. But for what purpose? Trembling, Emily turned and fled, the echoes of the whispers following her down the hall. She knew, deep in her bones, that the shadows would not stop. They had chosen her for a reason, and whatever lay behind that door, it would not rest until she confronted it. The shadows did not relent. Emily felt their presence at every turn, a constant weight on her shoulders that threatened to drag her under. Her dreams grew darker, more vivid. Each night she found herself standing before the basement door, her hand reaching for the rusted handle. She could hear the voices behind it more clearly now, desperate, pleading, and filled with an anguish that clawed at her soul. When she awoke, the echoes of those cries lingered, turning her waking hours into a living nightmare. The whispers followed her into daylight, coiling around her thoughts and distorting her perception of reality. She could no longer distinguish the line between dream and wakefulness. The school itself seemed to change, the walls narrowing, the corridors lengthening into endless mazes that always led back to that same door. Even her classmates seemed to move in a daze, their eyes glossing over as if they too were shadows of their former selves. Emily knew she had to find out what the shadows wanted, and more importantly, what lay behind that door. She began her search at the town's library, a dim, dusty building that felt like it had been forgotten by time. The librarian, an elderly woman with keen eyes that seemed to see right through her, gave her a wary glance as she asked for the school's history. "Not much to find there, dear," the woman said in a voice that cracked like dry leaves. "That school has a dark past, and most folks prefer to let sleeping dogs lie." Undeterred, Emily sifted through yellowed newspapers and brittle books. The town had a history, all right, and it was as dark as the basement that haunted her dreams. Decades ago, a series of children had gone missing. All of them were students at her school, and all disappeared without a trace. The town was in an uproar, demanding answers, but the investigation hit a dead end. The only link between the children was their attendance at the school. And then, just as suddenly as the disappearances began, they stopped. Emily's heart pounded as she uncovered the name of a teacher who had vanished around the same time as the last child, Mr. Holloway. He had been an enigmatic figure, beloved by some students and feared by others. The last known record of him was a police report stating that he had gone missing on the same night the final child disappeared. The investigation hinted at something sinister, but no concrete evidence was ever found, and Mr. Holloway became nothing more than a ghost story whispered among the townspeople. As Emily dug deeper, she found a thin, tattered file tucked away in the library's archive room, a diary labeled with Mr. Holloway's name. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the pages fragile and stained with time. The entries began innocuously enough, detailing his teaching methods and the joys of working with children. But as she read on, the tone shifted. Mr. Holloway began rambling about hidden worlds, unseen forces, and ancient rituals. He wrote about the basement in cryptic language, calling it the threshold and the gate between realms. The final entries were a descent into madness. Holloway spoke of voices in the shadows, of whispers that guided him to the truth. He wrote of a ritual, one that required the souls of children to bridge the realms and open the gate to a world beyond human comprehension. His handwriting became erratic, the sentences scrawled in desperate frenzy. The last page was nearly illegible, stained with what looked like dried blood, and bore a single line scratched into the paper. The shadows are the gatekeepers. They demand what was promised. Emily recoiled, her mind racing. The shadows in the basement were not just the restless spirits of the missing children. They were gatekeepers, bound to the dark ritual Mr. Holloway had attempted. And they were angry. Holloway had failed them, leaving them trapped between worlds. And now they were calling out to Emily to finish what he had started or to free them from their torment. Back at school, Emily confided in her only friend, Jake, whose skepticism had kept her grounded since her arrival. She showed him the diary, watching his expression shift from doubt to horror as he read. "This is insane, Emily," he said, his voice trembling. "We can't just mess with things like this. What if it's all true? What if there is something down there?" Emily's resolve hardened. "Then we need to find out what it is," she replied. "If those children are trapped, we have to help them. If Mr. Holloway left something unfinished, we need to know why the shadows are still here, why they're haunting me." Together, they snuck into the school's restricted archives, a dusty room filled with boxes of old records and forgotten files. It was here they found the blueprint of the school, its layout revealing something unexpected, a sub-basement beneath the main basement, a place that didn't appear on any modern map. It was labeled simply as the Chamber. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine as she traced the lines of the blueprint with her finger. The chamber lay directly beneath the school, hidden from sight. Whatever Mr. Holloway had done, it had been down there. And now, the shadows wanted her to find it. Jake looked at her, fear etched in his eyes. "You're not seriously thinking of going down there, are you?" Emily's eyes remained fixed on the blueprint. "I have to. They won't stop until I do. Whatever happened, it's connected to that place. I need to see it for myself." The shadows grew more aggressive after their discovery. At night, Emily's dreams became full-blown nightmares. The basement door was now open in her visions, a yawning black void from which skeletal hands reached out, clawing at the air, desperate to pull her into the darkness. She would wake up gasping for breath, her body drenched in sweat, the sensation of cold, clammy fingers still lingering on her skin. During the day, the shadows followed her relentlessly. They were no longer content with lurking in the corners of her vision. Now they moved openly, gliding along the walls and floors, casting grotesque silhouettes that twisted and writhed like tortured souls. Students began noticing her unease, whispering among themselves, but when Emily tried to speak of what she was experiencing, they turned away, their faces pale with fear. The whole school seemed to be under the shadow's oppressive grip, yet no one dared acknowledge it. One evening, as Emily was gathering her belongings from her locker, the lights flickered. The hallway grew unnaturally cold. She felt the air shift, and then a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned. The shadows had gathered, a mass of writhing darkness at the end of the hallway, shapes moving within it. Faces, dozens of them, emerged from the blackness, their eyes hollow and mouths open in silent screams. And then they spoke, not in whispers, but in a collective voice that reverberated through the empty hall. "You must open the door, Emily. You must free us." Emily stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. "What are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. "We are the forgotten, the sacrificed, the betrayed," the shadows hissed. "He promised us the gate would open, that we would cross to the other side. He failed. You must succeed where he failed. Set us free, or suffer as we have." Emily's blood ran cold. The entity that Holloway had tried to summon had turned the children into shadows, gatekeepers trapped between worlds. They were bound to the basement, bound to the promise of the ritual that Holloway had never completed, and now they demanded retribution. The shadows surged forward, and in a flash, Emily saw it all. The children lured into the basement, the dark rituals, the fear and betrayal as Holloway sealed the door behind them. Their agony, their despair, was etched into the very walls of the school, echoing through time. She gasped as the vision faded, leaving her on the cold floor, her mind reeling with horror. The basement was not merely a place of darkness. It was a nexus, a point where reality thinned and the barrier between worlds weakened. And whatever lay beyond that barrier was hungry. It had tasted the souls of children and wanted more. The shadows were both its servants and its prisoners, doomed to an eternity of waiting unless someone completed the ritual. Emily knew then that there was no turning back. The shadows would not release her. They had chosen her to be the key, to either unlock their prison or take their place in the darkness. She had to confront the basement, confront the shadows, and whatever entity lurked beyond the threshold. But as she stared at the darkened hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited her down there, behind the door, was something far worse than death itself. The storm outside raged with a fury that mirrored the turmoil within Emily. The wind howled against the school's stone walls, and thunder rumbled like the growl of some monstrous creature waiting to be unleashed. Inside, the hallways lay in oppressive silence, the air thick with anticipation. Emily stood at the top of the staircase leading down to the basement, gripping a flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Jake's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. They both knew that tonight would be the end of something, whether it would be the end of the nightmare or their lives was a question neither dared voice. They had planned everything. Emily had stolen the keys from the janitor's office, knowing that breaking into the basement would set off an alarm otherwise. The plan was simple. Go in, find the chamber, and confront whatever lay in wait. It sounded straightforward enough, but as they stood there, staring down into the inky darkness below, a gnawing dread clawed at Emily's insides. The basement was no ordinary place. It was a labyrinth of shadows, a maze designed to disorient and entrap. It was alive with a malevolent presence that had been waiting, biding its time. "We don't have to do this," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "We could just leave. Forget all of this." Emily shook her head. "You know we can't. The shadows won't let us. They won't let me." She turned her gaze back to the darkness. "If we don't end this tonight, it'll never end." With that, she took a deep breath and descended the stairs, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the stillness. Jake followed close behind, his flashlight casting jittery beams across the walls. The air grew colder with every step, the chill seeping into Emily's bones. It was as if they were descending into the very heart of winter. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering at the edge of the light, moving just beyond the reach of their gaze. Emily felt her heart hammering against her ribs, each beat a countdown to the unknown. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached the door. It loomed before them, a slab of rusted iron, its surface marred with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as she looked at them. Emily fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. The metal felt ice cold, burning against her skin. She slid the key into the lock, and for a moment, everything went still. The storm outside ceased, the wind quieted, and the air became suffocatingly thick. She turned the key, the lock clicked, and the door swung open with a creak that sounded like the groan of a dying beast. Darkness yawned before them, an abyss that seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors, lined with old storage rooms filled with forgotten relics of the school's past. Broken desks, moth-eaten flags, and crates covered in cobwebs littered the way, creating a claustrophobic path that twisted and turned like the insides of a serpent. The whispers began almost immediately, a faint murmur at first, like the rustling of leaves. But as they ventured deeper, the voices grew louder, more distinct. "Emily, Emily, come to us." They moved through the corridors, the walls closing in around them, the shadows pressing against their backs. Emily tried to focus on the blueprint they had memorized, counting the turns and doorways. Left, right, right, left, each step bringing them closer to the center, to the chamber. The whispers turned into wails, mournful cries that reverberated through the walls, rising and falling in a haunting symphony. Emily's skin prickled with each cry, her mind recoiling from the raw pain that filled the air. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a large, circular room. It was different from the rest of the basement. The air was colder, and the walls were lined with grotesque symbols etched into the stone, symbols that Emily recognized from Mr. Holloway's journal. In the center of the room was a stone altar, dark and stained, surrounded by shackles bolted into the floor. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea crashing over Emily. The air here was thick with malevolence, an almost tangible darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe with its own life. "This is it," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers that filled the room. "This is where it happened." Emily stepped toward the altar, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The shadows gathered at the edges of the room, watching, waiting. She could see their faces now, the children who had been lost. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their expressions twisted with fear and anger. And then she felt it, a presence behind her, ancient and powerful. It seeped into her mind like a poison, whispering promises of power, of knowledge, of escape. "Complete the ritual," it murmured, its voice slithering into her thoughts. "Set them free. Set us free." She turned and her flashlight flickered, illuminating the entity for a brief, horrifying moment. It was a mass of darkness, a void given form, its eyes burning like red coals in the night. It was both formless and yet all-encompassing, its presence filling the room, pressing against her very soul. Emily felt her legs buckle, her mind screaming to flee, but she couldn't move. The shadows surged forward, and she felt the cold, bony hands gripping her arms, dragging her toward the altar. "No!" Jake shouted, but the shadows swarmed around him, pushing him back. He stumbled, his flashlight falling to the ground and rolling away, casting wild beams of light across the room. Emily was pulled closer to the altar, the entity's whispering filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "Release us, and you shall be free. Complete the ritual. Use the mirror." Emily felt a surge of horror and realization. The mirror, it was in her pocket, the one she had brought with her. It wasn't just any mirror. It was a relic she had found in the library, mentioned in the final pages of Holloway's journal as a key to control the entity. In that moment of clarity, she understood the Shadow's true intentions. They didn't want to be set free. They wanted her to finish what Holloway had started, to open the gate and let the entity into the world. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, metallic surface of the mirror. The shadows shrieked as she pulled it out, their forms twisting and writhing in the light that the mirror reflected. The entity roared, a sound that shook the very foundation of the room, a sound of anger and fear. Emily raised the mirror, aiming it toward the mass of darkness. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the whispers turned into screams of rage and despair. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissipating into the air. The entity writhed, its shape distorting as the light tore through it. For a moment, Emily saw the truth of it, a being of pure malevolence, a hunger that knew no bounds. It had fed on the children's souls, twisting them into its servants, its gatekeepers. And now it was being forced back into the abyss. The light grew, consuming the darkness, filling the room with an unbearable brightness. Emily felt the ground beneath her shift, the altar cracking and splitting apart. The shadows screamed, their voices mingling with the entity's roar, a final, deafening cry that echoed through the basement as the very walls seemed to close in, the world folding into itself. And then, silence. Emily lay on the cold stone floor, the mirror still clutched in her trembling hand. The room was dark, but not with the oppressive living darkness of before. It was simply empty. The altar was gone, reduced to rubble. The shackles lay broken on the floor. The shadows were gone, their cries nothing more than an echo in her mind. "Emily," Jake's voice broke the silence, weak and filled with disbelief. He crawled toward her, his face pale, eyes wide with shock. Is it over?" She stared at the spot where the altar had stood, where the entity had been banished. She nodded slowly, her body trembling with the aftershocks of fear and adrenaline. "Yes," she whispered, "it's over, for now." They struggled to their feet, supporting each other as they made their way back through the basement's labyrinth. As they reached the stairs, Emily looked back one last time into the darkness. It was still and quiet, but she knew that the memory of what had happened here would haunt her forever. The shadows were gone, but the scars they had left behind would never fade. As they emerged into the stormy night, the school's dark silhouette loomed against the sky, a place that would forever hold the echoes of its past. The whispers had ceased, the shadows had been banished, but Emily knew that somewhere, in some corner of the world, the darkness was still watching, waiting. The rain had turned to a steady downpour, the droplets hammering against the school's stone walls like a relentless drumbeat. Emily stood just outside the entrance, drenched to the bone, her body numb with exhaustion and terror. Her eyes were fixed on the building, on the twisted, ancient architecture that had once seemed so imposing, and now looked hollow, defeated. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced, but the hollow echo of what had happened still lingered in the air. Jake leaned against the wall beside her, clutching his side where the shadows had seized him. His face was pale, eyes glassy with shock. But he was alive. They both were, and that was more than she had dared hope for when they had descended into the basement. She glanced at him, searching for something to say, but the words died in her throat. What comfort could she offer? They had survived, yes, but at what cost? As the rain poured down around them, Emily felt the coldness within her begin to thaw, replaced by a burning, aching emptiness. The faces of the children she had seen, those hollow eyes, the silent screams. They were free now, or so she told herself. But their torment, their suffering, had left an indelible mark on her soul. She had not just witnessed their pain, she had felt it, a deep, wrenching agony that would never fully leave her. The entity was gone, banished back to the void, but it had left pieces of itself behind, fragments that clung to the corners of her mind like cobwebs in a darkened room. "We need to go," Jake's voice broke the silence, hoarse and trembling. "This place, it's not safe. Not anymore." Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if anywhere would ever feel safe again. They turned to leave, but as they stepped onto the school's front lawn, she hesitated. Something wasn't right. The air around them felt too still, too heavy. She glanced back at the school and froze. In the windows, through the rain-splattered glass, she saw them. Shadows, faint and translucent, standing silently, watching them. Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a heart-stopping moment, she feared the worst. Had she failed? Had the entity somehow survived? But as she stared, the shadows did not move. They simply stood there, eyes hollow, faces blank. And then she understood. They were not the malevolent, twisted forms they had been in the basement. These were echoes, memories of the children who had been lost. They were no longer trapped, no longer bound to the darkness that had consumed them. They were watching, waiting for something. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The shadows were waiting for her acknowledgement, for her to see them as they had once been, innocent, not monstrous. She took a step forward, feeling Jake's grip tighten on her arm. "Emily, what are you doing?" he hissed. She shook her head. "It's okay," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She had to face them, to face what she had been a part of. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand, giving the faintest of waves to the figures in the windows. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. And then, one by one, the shadows began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart like mist in the morning sun. There was no malice in their departure, no anger, only a sense of release, a quiet sigh that drifted through the rain as they faded into nothingness. Emily stood there, the rain mingling with the tears that she had not realized were streaming down her face. She had freed them, not just from the entity, but from the darkness that had twisted them into nightmares. In their final moments, they had become whole again, if only as fleeting echoes. She felt a profound sadness settle over her, a sorrow for lives cut short, for innocence lost in the most brutal way. But intertwined with that sadness was a sliver of peace, a whisper of closure that soothed the raw edges of her fear. Jake pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. She leaned into him, feeling his warmth, his solidity. They were alive. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side, scarred but whole. As they began to walk away from the school, Emily glanced back one last time. The building stood silent and still, its windows dark and empty. The shadows were gone. The whispers had ceased. The school was just a building now, a relic of a haunted past. Yet, as they moved down the path, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. Not the entity, not the darkness, but a presence, a watchful gaze. She touched the mirror still tucked in her pocket, its surface now cracked and dimmed. It had been the key, the tool that had helped her banish the darkness. But it had also shown her the truth, a truth that was not easily forgotten. They reached the edge of the school grounds, where the iron gates stood open, leading back into the world beyond. Emily paused, staring at the world outside the gates, at the town that lay just beyond the curtain of rain. The normalcy of it seemed so distant, so alien to her now. Could she return to that world, to a life that pretended the shadows didn't exist? "What now?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily looked up at him, at the fear and uncertainty in his eyes. She took his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "We live," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "We remember, and we live." They stepped through the gates, the rain washing over them like a baptism, a cleansing of the darkness that had clung to their souls. As they walked away, Emily felt the weight of what she carried with her, memories of shadows, of whispers, of an evil that had nearly consumed her. But she also carried the memory of those final moments, of the shadows fading peacefully into the night. As they disappeared into the storm, the school stood silent, a sentinel over its own dark history. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful song that drifted across the grounds. The basement door, sealed shut, would remain untouched. The darkness had been banished, but the memory of it would linger, a shadow on the edge of consciousness. Emily knew that the battle was over, but the war with the shadows in her mind had only just begun. She would face them every night, in every darkened hallway, in every whisper of wind. But she would face them on her terms. She had seen the darkness and survived it. And now, as the storm began to pass and the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile and fleeting, but real. The entity was gone. The school was just a building again, and the shadows had found their peace. As for Emily, she walked into a future shadowed by the past, but illuminated by the promise of life. She had descended into darkness and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. And as long as she remembered the faces of those she had freed, she knew she could keep the darkness at bay. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the first birds began to sing the song of a new day. Emily and Jake moved forward, toward a life that awaited them beyond the horrors of the school basement. The whispers had ceased, but their story would live on, etched into the fabric of the town, a reminder of the darkness that had once threatened to consume them all.